Hello, everyone, and happy Earth Day. The 50th anniversary today of Earth Day, which was a monumental global movement that ushered in the environmental movement, of which we are, those of you who are on here today, I'm sure interested in the arc of that history and what's happened since then. I'm David Cash. I'm the Dean of the John W. McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at UMass Boston. Also a former commissioner of the state's Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Public Utilities, which gives me a particular perspective onto these issues. Given that it is Earth Day and we are celebrating that, it's an odd time to be celebrating this amidst a global crisis in which many are not celebrating, but suffering. Thousands of miles away from wherever you're sheltering in place to right next door. And we should never lose sight of that. In fact, alleviating suffering, I'm sure, is the motivations for why many of us are involved in the environmental movement. This talk and an Earth Day symposium that's going on at both before this and after this, that highlights student research sponsored by the UMass Boston School for Environment and Interim Dean Bob Chen. He's using a fantastic new innovative poster session online, which has been fantastic. These two events end Earth Week 2020 at UMass Boston. We've had a series of events from Christiana Figueres, the architect of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement last week, to Surya Panditi, the North American CEO of NLX, one of the largest providers of renewable energy in the world. Today, we'll explore what we can learn from our COVID response to help guide us in a more effective and equitable response to climate change. I'll be speaking first during this program, followed by Rebecca Herst, the director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston. And Rebecca, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Herst. I'm the director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston, as David said. We are an interdisciplinary partnership of 5 different colleges and 4 racial and ethnic institutes at University of Massachusetts, Boston. These are the School for the Environment, College of Management, College of Liberal Arts, McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Affairs, and the College of Nursing and Health Sciences. And also the Trotter Institute of African American Studies, the Institute for Asian American Studies, the New England Institute for Native American Studies, and the Gustone Institute for Latinx Studies. And we are focused on trying to understand the disproportionate impacts of climate change on historically marginalized communities and work with them to develop sustainable and equitable solutions. I'm really excited to be talking with you all today about some of the parallels between the climate crisis and the coronavirus crisis, because there's a lot of really scary things that we're seeing right now, but big opportunities to make policy change that will really help people's lives. So do you want to kick us off, David?
Yeah, I'll get us started. And right before that, I do want to acknowledge, even in this remote setting where we know that there are people who have signed in and online from all over the world, our UMass Boston campus, I think, as many people know, is important for us to acknowledge that this was land that was occupied by indigenous people prior to Europeans arriving here, and that's something that we should never lose sight of, especially and particularly when we're celebrating Earth Day. And I think that's something which is very important for us on campus, and very important, as Rebecca noted, that part of one of our partners is the New England Institute for Native American Studies, led by Cedric Woods on our team. So let me start as I am figuring out our technology here. Okay, great. So as I had mentioned, we are, this is the ending of our Earth Week celebrations over the last week. I think it's probably obvious to everyone that this particular talk was not planned as part of our original group of events, something that Rebecca and I spoke about, I think about 2 weeks ago. as we were in the midst of the exponential growth and our ability to look a little bit at what kinds of decisions were made and not made in terms of response to COVID, and to take a step back and try to think, how does that relate to climate change? So we're going to spend some time today looking at those kinds of interactions. Just for a little housekeeping, if you're on social media, these are the hashtags we're using and the Twitter handles that we're using. And while about 45 or so registrants submitted questions, you are able to ask questions throughout this. You can see the email at the bottom, mccormack.gradschool@umb.edu. You're welcome to submit a question. We'll try to field them as best as we possibly can. So, just on a very high level, how are these two events, these two dynamics, similar? And I want to just kind of frame up, and there are many, many other ways to frame this. This is a short talk, and it's very high level, but these are some of the 5 principal areas where I think there are a lot of similarities. And since there's similarities in the dynamics of the system itself, it raises the question of, are there similarities in what kind of policy responses we should have? So both of the systems, climate change and COVID, have lags in a nonlinear system. That is, if a person is infected, they may be asymptomatic or not. They may interact with lots of people or not. And the impact of their interactions with people won't be felt by the people they interact with for weeks later. So for example, at a time in this country where there were no cases, it's now very clear that there were a lot of people who were infected. And so as people met people, and those people met people, we saw an exponential growth. Climate change exhibits some very similar kinds of dynamics. They are in some ways more complicated than just merely exponential growth, because we have tipping points, major nonlinearity. So for example, you could have constant increase in sea level rise, and at the moment that the Western Antarctic ice sheet comes off, then you'd see a big jump. So it's not quite as smooth, but it's similar kinds of things. And both mean that if you take later actions, the impacts will be much greater and the cost will be much greater. So those are 2 similarities in both of these. Both represent, as we can see from the debates that are happening throughout the United States right now, that there needs to be a balance of health of people and planet and the economy. Certainly, there are ways that actions can be taken that enhance both of those, but there are times when there are trade-offs as well. And so those need to be taken into account. Both issues have exhibited major questions of equity. We see time and time again that the impacts of climate change, whether they be the hurricanes that we've seen, or flooding, et cetera, have major equity dimensions in which the most vulnerable in our communities, in our societies, are hit harder, have more difficulty responding, have less tools available to them. And as we have seen in a number of cases, investments in both response and investments in mitigation are not always, the benefits are not always shared equally. These are, climate change is certainly a classic case of externalities. That is, fossil fuel companies do not internalize, pay for the costs of the products that they sell. That's pretty classic environmental economics. In COVID, what we've seen is that behaviors can have the same kind of thing. That is, and I'll get to them in a little bit, but the spring break partiers were not internalizing the costs of what they were doing. That is, if they transmitted the virus to one another, came back to their communities, they were not accounting for the costs of their actions. So essentially, stay-at-home orders are attempts to internalize those externalities. And then both display very complicated global to local dynamics. Borders are essentially meaningless in the transmission, in protecting from the transmission of the virus, and borders certainly are not respected by pollutants. And certainly CO2 is your classic pollutant that doesn't matter where it's emitted, has an impact. Okay, And both have, in terms of the responses, both the policy responses and executive responses can be argued, as I will, have been too slow and have been of inadequate action. Okay, too slow is really important in these lagged systems, and inadequate action to something that's going to be exponential can be really problematic as well. So one of the ways I kind of first thought about this talk was I'm a person who's very intrigued by graphs and what they can explain. And as I kept on looking at the COVID-19 deaths graphs and the transmission graphs, they really reminded me, not surprisingly, of climate change related graphs. And I really tried to understand through graphs what was going on here and what kind of mistakes were being made or missteps in the policy realm. And I identified 7 of them here. And I'm only going to focus on like 5 in each of the cases. And I'm going to go through these quickly. But one is the marginalization of scientific advice, that is science not necessarily being used, particularly early on. The diminishment of public perception of risk, limited upfront investment in actions to mitigate the risk. So that's the inaction, the investment in inaction, and lack of internalizing these externalities. Really difficult for regular citizens and policymakers to understand the exponential or nonlinear tipping point behavior of a system. There's been relatively, again, in some areas, poor federal, state, and municipal coordination, and then the ignoring of equity. So I'm just going to kind of frame up for you this is a very kind of heuristic way. I have not done in-depth research on this. I haven't done a comparative analysis. It's a way that's helping me, and I hope others who are interested in this area, to kind of think through this system. So if I take those 5 bolded ones above. So here back in 2018 is when President Trump disbanded the Global Health Security and Biodefense Unit that's in the National Research Council, where it is now unable to provide the right kind of scientific advice to the administration or to Congress in terms of pandemics. So this was one of many, many ways that during the lead up to the pandemic, scientific advice was ignored. In fact, I'm just going to give one example of each of these. Go back home and you could put on this graph even more of those, because there are many of them that we've seen. And this is the first one I just wanted to note as the marginalization of scientific advice. The diminishment of public perception of risk. So here's another example. By the way, I just wanted to bring you to the scale. This is 3 months, January, February, March into part of April, right? So we know that we have been listening to the daily briefings that the president has been given, and early in this, while things had been already getting somewhat out of control in China, the president said it will all work out well. Again, this was one of a number of kinds of statements he said along these lines, as did other politicians, elected officials, people in the executive branch. So what's happening there then is that the public is not perceiving the risk, and therefore the public may or may not take actions that are commensurate with the risk that they're facing. Okay, so here's an example in the COVID case of limited upfront investments and actions that could mitigate the risk. So you may recall in January and February, it was possible for the US government to utilize the WHO test kits. Now, it is true, it's pretty standard practice for the US to develop its own, but things were also happening very quickly. So there is debate on what the impact of this was, but it was pretty clear that we did not, and actually still don't have, an adequate supply of test kits. So we didn't invest. Now, it would have been a big investment to mitigate those kinds of risks, as would using a variety of the actions that the executive branch could have done to require companies to build ventilators and all those kinds of things. So the example that I had given you earlier is of number 4, did not internalize externalities. And so the spring break exposures are a really good example of that, where those who might have been, had the virus, asymptomatic, although we're being told at that time it was good to have social distancing, we're not doing that. And they did not bear the cost of that. I'm skipping 5 and 6 right now, but it's been one of the things that struck me about equity in this case, and there's a lot of research now that's already come out that shows that communities of color, low-income communities are bearing the costs of this, of the pandemic. One very striking case was the guidelines that came out in Massachusetts on April 7th, which prioritized healthcare workers and the young, but also prioritized those that were more healthy. And many critics came out and said, well, wait a minute, in vulnerable communities and communities of color that already do not have good health because of structural racism, because of inadequate healthcare insurance, because of living in places that are closer to environmental impacts, they're already going to be compromised in health. And so by not allowing them to have ventilators, you're just exacerbating that. Okay, so that's the kind of like framework of thinking about this in the COVID perspective. 3 months where really important early on in those conversations, discussions of how do you flatten this curve. All of these are the work in the opposite direction of flattening the curve. Okay, let's take a look at a similar shaped graph. This is actual data of global surface temperature up until the early 2000s, and projected is the red line. And again, I chose the same too slow, inadequate action pieces. I chose 5 to compare, but you could choose your own and you could choose different ones that I'm choosing. So, and I'm gonna bounce around to be mostly chronological. And most of these are in those 3 decades of the 90s to the 2000s to the 2010s, those 3 decades. So we're not talking 3 weeks. The decision-making happening in climate change, which is a much slower dynamic than COVID, is compressed into 3 months in COVID, and in the way that I'm looking at it now is 3 decades, although you could go back further as well. So there's been a lot, if we look at number 3, limited upfront investment in actions to mitigate risks. One of those investments is tax breaks, for example. And there has been, since the production tax credit for renewable energy in 1992, there's been a huge amount of uncertainty. Sometimes Congress revotes for it, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. It's provided a lot of uncertainty to mitigate the risks, and that, that would qualify as inadequate action. You could see the many different ways, and again, Katrina is just one example, and we can see that with Maria and Harvey, et cetera, these hurricanes, where one could say that the response to that demonstrated an inequity in the system, again, in terms of responses. Again, number 4, not internalizing externalities. I had the pleasure to help work on the Waxman-Markey bill when I was working in state government. And one central piece of the Waxman-Markey bill was to internalize the externalities through a cap and trade program. Now, carbon tax can do that as well, but that failed. So we were not able to internalize the externalities. Now, some states have done that. By the way, for each of these, you could come up with an example that has been successful. And so, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast states has been very successful in this regard. Just to go back to the number 2, diminishment of public perception of risk. The first time Donald Trump called climate change a hoax was in 2013, but I think as we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years that diminishment of the risk has happened again and again. And the last of these points is the marginalization of scientific advice. And the history of this administration in many different ways has been to cut the role of science in EPA, in the US Global Change Research Program, et cetera. So again, each of these kind of missteps, policy missteps, then ends up to an inflection in the curve that allows it to keep on growing. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is as we think about COVID and flattening the curve, I think it's very instructive to think very analogously in the climate debate. And I was very fortunate in this last week. I have a friend of mine who is a strong climate change advocate and activist named Andrew Boyd, who has worked on a tool that can help see this. And it actually just came out 2 days ago and was officially came out yesterday. It's called Flatten the Curve. You can go to it online here. I included these pieces, I included these pieces on the bottom just because I want to give credit where it's due. This is science-based, The right people can be noted here. Everybody, by the way, will have access to these. But I just want to show you really quickly how we think about the policy responses I described above and the ability or not to flatten the curve. So what I love about this tool, you might remember that I said I love graphs and I love playing around with policy. And what this tool lets you do is kind of think about the size of the investment, how adequate the investment is, and the speed of action. So you might recall in my earlier slides, I had noted that policy seemed to be too slow and not adequate. So what this does is let you think, okay, what if we can have a really big investment, lowers the temperature, lowers the emissions. I keep making that bigger. Now remember, the 1.5 degrees Celsius is what Paris is saying we should try to get to, and what scientists are saying we should try to get to avoid the worst of the damage. And okay, so let's say we even make the largest investment, maximum investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency, and storage, etc. It brings our emissions down, but temperature not adequately enough. So even if we went whole hog, but waited out decades, it would not be effective. And likewise, if we had a very fast action, we acted now, still not be adequate to bring our temperature down to the place we need to be. So again, this, you could play with this, you could look around and, how this would change things. Even serious investment and quick action is not enough. It seems pretty clear that you need to take really strong action, fast action and strong action to address climate change. Now, we can look, for example, in the COVID cases where countries like South Korea did act very quickly, did have a sizable investment in terms of the social distancing, testing that they put in place. And that's where we've seen the big spike in cases in COVID has been where there has been inadequate action and slow action. And likewise, what we think now is that if we don't take action quickly on climate change, and it's not of adequate investment, if we're not shifting to renewable energy wholesale, if we're not maximizing electric vehicles, if we're not maximizing energy efficiency, we're not going to be able to get there. So I hope you found that helpful. I've loved this heuristic because it really helps you think about both time and level of investment. And what it really points out, again, is that the impacts can be huge, and those impacts, as we have seen already, can have inordinate impacts on most vulnerable. And that's where Rebecca will take it from here. So I'm going to unshare here and pass it over to Rebecca. And so go get it, go to it, Rebecca, and then we'll have Q&A after Rebecca's done.
Great, thanks, David. So as David mentioned, I am going to share a little bit about what are the different ways that climate change and coronavirus are connected to questions of equity. So I thought it would be helpful today to share a little bit about the data for who the COVID-19 crisis is hitting the hardest, how that relates to climate change, and go into some of the research that has come out about how to make different people more resilient following climate disasters, and how that can apply to our COVID-19 response. And then I'll offer a few specific policy recommendations and go into some preliminary thoughts about how our understanding of COVID-19 will probably inform future thinking around climate change. So to start off, who is COVID-19 hitting the hardest? And as David mentioned, and as you probably have all seen, it's hitting historically marginalized communities much harder than more affluent white communities. This chart shows fatalities in different states where the race is known, and this is accounting for, this shows the percent of population and the percentage of deaths, and looks at the Black population. So you can see at the top here, and I think if I use my mouse, you guys can see this. In DC, Blacks account for about 45% of the population, but are accounting for about 75% of the deaths for COVID-19. And the longer the bar is, the bigger discrepancy between the percentage of the population and the percentage of deaths. So this is obviously very upsetting. Nationally, the Associated Press doesn't have complete data, but for the data that is known, it looks like Blacks are accounting for about a third of COVID-19 deaths, while they only make up 14% of the national population. So that's huge and is really, showing us the long-term health crisis and health inequities that we already knew existed, but it's happening very quickly in a really dramatic way. This is also clearly an economic crisis. And we know that with unemployment, the poverty rate increases. So this chart shows the current poverty rate, or the poverty rate as of February 2020 by race. And then depending on how high the employment rate goes, how much that could shift depending on for different populations. And what I think is really interesting here is that we can see that there's already a big discrepancy between Blacks and whites. February 2020, the estimate was a little over 8% of poverty rate for white people and a little under 20% for Black people. But if we get up to 30% unemployment, while there is an increase for both populations, the increase is much bigger for Blacks. So that is telling us that the gaps are widening even more. That for white people, the increase would be about 2% of an increase, whereas for Blacks it would be closer to 6%. So triple the increase. That's really upsetting. And as we're thinking about our response, we need to have these numbers in mind so that our response can actually address the people who are most impacted and try and deal with these problems so that we're not amplifying inequities that already exist. So you probably won't be surprised to hear that climate disasters also hit vulnerable populations the hardest. There was some research that came out of Rice University and University of Pittsburgh after Harvey that these next two graphs come from. This graph you'll see has wealth on one axis and then the amount of property damage in a county on the x-axis. And the more damage there was, the wider the gap between wealth in white educated homeowners and Black less educated renters. So what this is showing us is that after disasters, white people are able to bounce back more quickly and more easily than less educated Black renters are. This is true not just in places where there isn't any intervention, but actually they found that places where there was FEMA aid, the inequality increased. So this is really problematic, right? We really want to make sure that the aid that we're investing in communities is getting to the people who are hardest hit, and that we're not amplifying inequities with our aid programs. This graph, just to highlight it for you again, has wealth, and then as you go further along the x-axis and see the amount of aid received, the more FEMA aid that was received by a county, the wider the gap between the white educated homeowner and Black less educated renters. So what can we do about this? Because obviously it's clear from these graphs that I've shown, which I'm also a big fan of graphs, as David is, that our policy decisions are the ones that are putting us in this predicament, so they should be the ones to get us out of it as well. So one thing that we can focus on is making sure that we're reaching the people who are most at need with the policy instruments. So People, I'm sure, have heard a lot about the small business loan program. Just yesterday, a huge new slug of money was going towards it. I'm sure people have also heard about, after floods, different buyback programs, the FEMA aid that was discussed on a previous slide. And as we're developing these programs, we need to make sure that we have, that people who need them are able to access them. So often people are, the application process is really cumbersome and challenging. It might take weeks or months for aid to come down to, show up. And if you are a renter and, don't have enough rent to pay, don't have enough money to pay next month's rent, and move in with family members or leave, you don't have time to wait months for FEMA aid to come help you with your rent. Whereas if you are a homeowner, potentially you have a longer timeline. Right now, what we're seeing is that people who have more experience applying for big programs and also who have longer banking relationships have been able to access these federal programs more easily. So if we really want to help people who are most vulnerable, we need aid to come very fast. We need the barriers for applications to be really low. And we need to ensure that that who's taking advantage of them is who we intend to be taking advantage of them. There were a number of different programs after Sandy where in New Jersey, the African Americans and Hispanic Americans were being rejected from the programs at higher rates than white Americans. And, was that because of implicit bias? Was it because the requirements for the program were different? There are lots of different things that we need to be thinking about, but we need to make sure that programs are meeting the needs of the most vulnerable. We also need to focus on housing stability. Some preliminary research out of Hurricane Katrina shows that the faster people were put into more stable housing, the more quickly they were able to rebound, and the more sustained their rebound was. So even if they had moved to Houston or someplace else, if they were in stable housing more quickly, they were able to be more resilient. Similarly, a lot of research has shown that social connections and social networks are what is really essential for resilience. After the Chicago heat wave in the 90s, also the tsunami and nuclear meltdown in Japan, the people who had the best outcomes were people who had social networks. And so as we're thinking about responding to this crisis related to COVID-19, we need to really prioritize keeping people in their homes. Thankfully, this disaster has not destroyed housing stock as many climate disasters do. But for people to be able to be resilient to this huge shock to the system, being close to people that they know, and in their own homes will allow them to be more resilient long term. So by investing in rental assistance, having more aid for housing court so that people can be represented, and then also longer term focusing on community land trusts. These are some things that can allow people to be more resilient, stay in their communities, and rebound from this crisis. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about trauma. One of my colleagues at UMass Boston, Jean Rhodes, has done some research after Hurricane Katrina looking at people's ability to be resilient after that disaster. And this is a picture of the Astrodome in Houston with people after Katrina looking for names of loved ones, missing people. And What they found in their research was that people who had experienced post-traumatic stress syndrome and psychological distress before Katrina were much more likely to experience it afterwards. This is problematic because it can impact your ability to hold down a job, take care of your kids, move forward in your life. And we need to be thinking about the impacts of trauma that people have already experienced as we're moving forward, trying to address this current crisis. So access to mental health care is really important. And then also, a lot of people have experienced, big challenges trying to access services and support with the government that they're entitled to because of racism and systemic inequities. So we need to also be thinking about having culturally competent social workers who can help people apply for things, help people navigate the system that maybe wasn't built with them in mind, but should have been, so that they can access resources that they're entitled to. So again, really, these are some of the key things that have come out of disaster response literature so far, that really thinking about how to tailor programs directly for those who are most impacted, investing in social networks and keeping people in their homes so that they're able to rely on their communities to be more resilient, and then understanding the impact of trauma on people's ability to bounce back. So those are some things about how, what research has shown about responding to climate change that I think we can take into our coronavirus response. And now I want to talk about a couple things that I've really been wrestling with and thinking about from the coronavirus as we think about climate adaptation. So, it's been astounding to see the entire world shut down, and has been really, while David said that a lot of people, there were the partiers in Miami, but also there are a lot of people who are, staying home to protect other people. And, this sort of global show of solidarity, I think, is really powerful. And, Peter Kalmus, who's a climate scientist, said it really well, I thought. The coronavirus teaches us two critical climate lessons. One, we can't afford a Green New Deal. And two, when we agree as a society that something is an emergency, we come together to address it. So, I think there's the coronavirus is really unearthing a lot of the or like laying bare a lot of the inequities that that we've already known exist. And as David shared, the 3-week time period versus the 3-decade time period really heightens our understanding of how stark some of these inequities are. And also, this is obviously unlike anything I've ever seen in my life. And, it does make me think differently about what a mobilized response could look like. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is this idea of adaptive recovery that Juliette Kayyem has put forth. And this goes into 5 stages of crisis management. And in the middle, you can see a little like bubble thing that says, we are still here. Often after climate disasters, it's sort of like one event and then we recover. That's sort of how we think about it. But actually, as climate change continues to accelerate, and as we have more and more climate disasters, we will need to be much more focused on adaptive recovery. We won't be able to, respond to the one crisis and move on, but actually the ground is going to continue to shift under our feet. And we're going to need to be thinking about, what our quote new normal is. And, unfortunately, there isn't a vaccine at the end of the tunnel for climate change. But, as we're thinking about the ways that we are responding to the coronavirus, I think it's interesting to keep in the back of our minds, how can this adaptive response help us frame future adaptation efforts. With that, I also wanted to share a couple of funds that are supporting people who are hit the most locally. The Mass Redistribution Fund was started by Alex Papali, who's at Clean Water Action, and some other folks. He's on our Climate Adaptation Forum Steering Committee, and it has a number of different organizations that are supporting direct response for COVID-19, and also some organizations that are trying to deal with some of these systemic issues. Similarly, the One Chelsea Fund is supporting folks in Chelsea, which, as you probably have heard, has been particularly hard hit locally for all of the reasons. You know, this is a way that we can support folks locally. And actually, I was talking to Alex yesterday, and I think that the One Chelsea Fund is going to be one of the funds that the Mass Redistribution Fund sends money to as well. So with that, thank you very much, and we're going to go into questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, we got a whole host of questions prior to the event, and we've gotten a couple through emails now. Here's one from Gabriela Bocio Santos, who's at BU, and I'm pretty sure she's on here. Rebecca, this is for you. How do we do better than going back to normal, in quotes, going back to normal? What strategies can we carry forward to be more just, sustainable, and resilient?
Yeah, great. Hi, Gabriela, if you're on. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, you know, sort of embedded in that is also the understanding that, you know, this idea of, you know, often when people are talking about resilience and saying like, oh, we want to bounce back to the way things were, it's like, well, you know, for lots of folks in our community, the current situation is pretty bad, and we don't want to be in this current situation. We want to be moving forward to a sustainable and equitable reality where people can, you know, have access to good jobs and clean air. So I think that some of the things that I mentioned around, you know, being really clear about who we're tailoring programs for, I recognize that, you know, there were some interesting articles that I've read that talk about how often after disasters, people are like, we're going to take care of homeowners. We're going to make sure homeowners are okay. You know, we got to take care of homeowners, and how, you know, disenfranchising that can be, because there are so many people who are renters. And if policies are really directed at homeowners, then other people are left out. So I think that one of the things that we're really seeing with the coronavirus is it's just showing us very drastically the health inequities and economic inequities that exist. And I think that gives us an opportunity to face them and then develop policies to address them and take responsibility for previous policies that set things up in the way that they did.
Great.
So David, a question for you is, how do you think the climate adaptation and infrastructure funds will be connected to future coronavirus aid, if any? And how do you think that will play out?
Great question, and very timely, and allows me to go from my somewhat theoretical graphs to actual concrete policy makings that can and should be happening. So the second slug of stimulus money targeting small businesses just came out. I think it was $380 billion or something like that. And my guess is there will be other rounds of stimulus funding. This is going to be a long economic recovery road. And it seems like really huge opportunity to be investing in the energy system that we want, that can help flatten the curve, that can provide clean energy jobs, that can keep energy dollars more local. And this is not a new thing in the face of major economic problem to figure out how both economic redevelopment and rebuilding can happen at the same time that other goals can be met. A former Secretary of the Department of Energy, Ernie Moniz, had an article a couple of weeks ago in which he highlighted the comparison to both the Great Depression in the 1930s and the Great Recession in 2008. In both of those times, if you think back to what you remember about the Great Depression, huge amount of federal funding went to building new dams, building transmission lines, rural electrification, and that really built the foundation for the growth after World War II of our economy, and huge impacts on our country. Likewise, after the 2008 recession, with the American Recovery Act funding, about $90 billion of that went to clean energy. And I think it can be argued that that was a pretty significant amount of funding that 12 years later, was very instrumental in bringing down the price of wind and solar. So it's almost comparable to natural gas in some places. And those investments were made for research and development. They were made to assist companies to commercialize. They were made for states to invest in renewable energy and energy efficiency, and Massachusetts took big advantage of those. That's an example of where government can really be leaning forward and trying to solve one problem and getting a win-win out of it. So the answer to the question you asked is, I think that the best way to respond is for the next slug of stimulus funding, for a huge part of it, and we could be talking trillion now, not tens of billions, to go into remaking the energy system that we want, the energy system that we need, the energy system that can bring down that curve. And so a slug of funding like that right at this point would be instrumental. It would immediately slide those levers over to fast action and adequate action on the heuristic that I had. So I'm hoping something comes of that, and I think there should be a lot of pressure to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think as we're thinking about that, it's really important to remember that there are lots of different ways that the Green New Deal. Say the Green New Deal all the time, but I mean the New Deal left out people of color, and the housing policies that were enacted as part of the New Deal.
That's right.
Really set the stage for segregation, and now a lot of the issues that we're currently seeing from COVID-19 because of clean air and so on. And so as we're sort of goes back to Gabriella's question, and also one from John Bolduc here about this is really showing the dysfunction in our system that goes back a long way. Yeah. And as we're thinking about these policies, we need to recognize that and also find a way to address it in the policies we come up with.
Exactly. And it's not just about protecting vulnerable communities from impacts, it's about spreading the benefits, right? And so again, if those $1 trillion that I mentioned is going to transforming our energy system, it's got to be done with an eye toward clean energy jobs exactly in those communities that are economically disadvantaged now. And what's advantageous about clean energy spending is a huge portion of it can be local, right? I mean, an energy auditor, someone who comes into your home, cannot be outsourced. Someone who puts up solar panels on your roof cannot be outsourced. The person who maintains wind turbines cannot be outsourced. Those are all things that we should really be looking to for job growth in already disadvantaged communities so that the transformation to a clean energy economy, again, if we want to talk win-win, well, let's do win-win-win and figure out how we can have economic development that's in communities that has been bypassed in these kinds of efforts.
Yeah, totally. What do you think some of the long-term impacts of this crisis will be on our ability to have the political will to address climate change?
Well, it's interesting in the tweet that you had there that showed people coming together when everybody is faced by high risks. In a way, I think it could cut both ways, right? And this has to do with the lags that I was mentioning earlier. In a way, I'll start with the negative so I could end on a positive note. In a way, people will just go back to normal. Climate change does not have the same kind of immediate impact that COVID does. In fact, Tom Rivett-Carnac, the co-author of Christiana Figueres's new book that was featured last week, The Future We Choose, on his podcast, he mentioned, the difference when you have a wildfire in California, you put out the fire. You get firefighters to put out the fire as quickly as you possibly can. You don't have people turn off their engines. You don't have power plants shut down because the cause of the problem is much more distant. For COVID, it's the opposite, right? You isolate people right away. You eventually will give vaccines. You take care of them. You put ventilators. You give them ventilators, right? It's the symptom is kind of coterminous with the cause, and that's not the case. So there's a chance we'll just go back and we'll still have the problem of we don't really understand the lag. We don't see the problem. I mean, we have seen, with Maria and Harvey and the wildfires, and the list is long of the last 3 or 4 years where we've had these. Has concern about climate change inched up? Yes, it has, but not dramatically. So that's on the negative. On the positive, and you sort of mentioned this, we're in a global pandemic unlike anybody on this Zoom has dealt with ever, because nobody on this earth has dealt with that. And we are seeing examples of suffering that's collective, suffering that we can understand, and we're yearning for ability to solve that problem knowing that we need collective action. And so once we're on the other side of COVID, maybe one of the take-home messages is, wow, when there's a global problem, we need to work together to solve this global problem. And maybe people will start thinking that climate change is that next kind of global problem. So there's a series of questions on not just what individuals can do, but like what can climate action groups be focusing on now? What's the best strategy to bring climate into the COVID debate, discussions on that? I know we should focus on system change, but what actions can individuals take? What's some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the key things that we can do is invest in frontline communities and in the folks who are being most impacted, because they know what's needed to heal heal their bodies and heal our homes and so on. And I think that as we strengthen strengthen those communities, we as a society will be much stronger. And so some of that has to do with understanding more about traditional ecological knowledge, having a better sense of our connections to the earth. And then also, we need to be thinking about voting. We need to be thinking about political power. We need to be thinking about who has a say at the table and how decisions are made. Like, as a upper middle class white woman, even though my job is to think about climate justice, I don't know the best ways to incorporate the needs of folks who are most impacted into these policies. And so making sure that people are at the table and able to speak for themselves, I think, is really essential. And so to do that, we need to help them build power and and then listen to what they have to say.
Great. Well, we have a minute. Give us a 30-second ending comment, and then I'll end with a 30-second ending comment, and then we'll say goodbye.
Well, I think that, there's so much that we don't know about the future, but we do know that our system is set up to help some and disadvantage others, and that in order to be more resilient as a society, we need to look those inequities in the eye and address them straight on. And I will also say that you can make the plug, but our next Climate Adaptation Forum with Juliette Kayyem, who is someone who I quoted in my presentation, and some other awesome speakers to be announced, will be on June 5th. So stay tuned for that as well.
Excellent, great. My closing summary is consistent with Rebecca's of voting. I mean, we're going to have an opportunity to vote to protect climate in the fall, and we should exercise that responsibility. While Rebecca said there's so much we don't know about the future, very, very true, there's a lot that we know about the past, and even the recent past. So I think that we can look at, part of my exploring those graphs is to look at the last 4 months and say, well, what did we do well and what did we not do well? And we can, I think it's really clear, take-home message from both actions is to act fast and to act with adequate support and investment to solve the problem. And if that doesn't happen, we'll be paying for it in the future. All right, thank you very much, everybody. We appreciate you
Thanks, everyone.
Joining us. This has been exciting for us. Great to get your questions. And we will, by the way, we will post the video of this and we will post the slide decks as well. So thank you very much. Have a very good rest of the afternoon. And again, happy Earth Day. Stay healthy and safe. Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.